Alrighty, we are live now. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Nahmaduhu wa nusalli ala Rasulil Kareem. Mabad. Thank you everybody for joining today's very important, critical, and very relevant podcast. And today, for this podcast, we are honored to host one of the world's foremost voices on ethics of war and strategic thought, Professor Dr. Joel Hayward. Professor Joel Hayward is described by Kirkus Review as undeniably one of the academia's most visible Islamic thinkers and recognized for 3 consecutive years in the Muslim 500 as one of the world's 500 most influential Muslims. Dr. Hayward just recently also received an International Excellence Award for 2025 for his book, Prophet Muhammad the Warrior. He's more than a scholar. He bridges gaps between the two worlds, this Western academic thought and the Islamic thought. He's currently the Dean of Sycamore Leadership Academy. He has served in numerous prestigious academics, including Chief Executive of the Cambridge Muslim College in UK. He has plenty of experience in military history and strategic thought and international law. He is the director of the International Institute for International and Civil Security in UAE. He was the dean of the Royal Air Force College in the UK. He has his doctorate in military history. He is professor of strategic thought. He has written numerous books on Sirah and on leadership and on the life of Prophet Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. And he holds ijazah in Islamic sciences as well, including Aqidah and Sirah. And he has a lot of experiences, a lot of books, especially the leadership of Muhammad and the warrior prophet. And relative to this particular podcast, he has also written works on the principles of warfare in Islam. So, well, thank you so much, Professor. Thank you so much for giving us your time and valuable time and joining us and educating us on this very critical topic and relating to the things that are going around the world.
Thank you so much. It's always good to see you.
Always.
And I have been quite shocked by the events of the last week. I've been shocked, in fact, by the events of the last couple of years, but I'm not really surprised by it. I've become an old man. And I'm old enough that I remember when Gulf War I broke out and my beloved sister rang me. This is 1990, August 1990, when Iraq invaded Kuwait and said, I think World War III has started. And that got me thinking a lot about the nature of the human experience. I've made my career teaching war and strategy and international law, international humanitarian law in particular. And I think that perhaps I've got a few ideas that might help people to understand what's going on. Every day I get emails from Muslims in particular saying, how can these crimes go unpunished? What's actually happening? How can a state attack another state? Is that legal? What is the law regarding these things? So I thought perhaps you and I would have this discussion where we try and lay out, in fact, what the law does say about armed conflict and what the law says about, for example, the protection of the innocent, civilians, non-combatants, and so on. And what I thought I would do is I thought I would talk through a PowerPoint, first of all, because I want to look at some of the wording of the United Nations Charter from 1945, and in particular, the Geneva Conventions, the additional protocols of 1977, and actually put the words on the screen because I'm suspecting that a lot of our audience have never actually seen the Geneva Conventions and seen the way it's written and expressed, and therefore they'll perhaps guess what it says, but to actually see it is a helpful experience, I think. So if that's okay with you, I'll open my PowerPoint. Feel free as well to jump in as I go. And then at the end, I'll turn it back over to you. And you can put any questions you have or anyone watching might have. and I'll try and answer them, inshallah.
Well, thank you so much, Professor. Yes, please. Uh, over to you.
So, it's a lovely poster you made. Thank you very much.
Thank
Uh,
you.
international humanitarian law is the subset of international law that deals with war and conflict. The word humanitarian seems to imply that it's about aid and food and making sure people aren't starving. Well, that's part of it. But the primary function of international humanitarian law is to create a framework for the use of armed violence. War is organized violence. That's the best way to describe it. It's state-organized violence, ordinarily against other states, sometimes, astaghfirullah, against the people in one's own state. Sometimes governments make war against their own people, or the people make war against their own governments. But what we're going to talk about today is war between states. And hopefully, as I said, I'll give you some ideas on how we can understand the nature of violence. So with that said, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, Alhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salamu ala Rasulillah Muhammad, al alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in, amma ba'ad. So let me start by, if my PowerPoint's going to work.
It is. It's not full screen, but yeah, we can see that.
There we go.
Oh, here we go. It is. Okay, now. Okay, good.
First, I'm going to put up just for a second so that readers can see it. If they have any questions or they object to something I've said, feel free to email me. My website is there and my email address is there. I'm not always right. I try to be precise and accurate. I try to be factual, but like any scholar, I can get things wrong. So if anything that you disagree with, anyone watching, email me. I'm keen to learn. So off we go. Law follows ethics. Ethics or morality are those guiding principles in society that are necessary to minimize harm. So, for example, we know that if someone drinks and drives, that's a bad thing to do. That's a moral position on it. Why is it bad? Because it causes harm, like domestic violence. It's harmful. Something that forms a hard moral position then forms into a legal position where we say, how do we stop the harm? So with that in mind, let me tell you about what's called just war, which is the philosophical tradition that has evolved primarily in the West, although there is an Islamic equivalent that we're going to talk about. What happened is, going back all the way to Cicero in the ancient Roman world, people began to say, well, we're good at war, but war is a vulgar thing. The use of violence seems uncivilized, and we pride ourselves on our civilization. The Roman Empire became a Christian empire in the 4th century, and Christians, believing in the brotherhood or the brother and sisterhood of man and women, said, how do we continue to keep our people safe whilst maintaining the sanctity of life that God has bestowed upon us? And so there were a whole series of writers, including Augustine of Hippo, Ambrose, Thomas Aquinas, of course, the greatest of all the Christian theologians, Francisco de Vitoria, Hugo Grotius, who created a framework for understanding how Christians in particular can go to war and stay moral. And they use the Latin word for that, which is ius, which means just. How do you stay just? How do you have justice in war? And over the last 2,000 years, we evolved some conclusions about that. The first thing that we said is that war is always a hateful thing. And interestingly, in our holy book, as Muslims, Quran, we have the same kind of phrase used for it, where God says, you hate something. He's talking about war that may actually be good for you. And the Christians have a similar view of war, that war is a hated thing, but is not necessarily morally wrong. Now, is it commonly wrong? Well, if you're a pacifist, you'll say it's always wrong. But pacifists are actually the minority of humans, and most people would accept that sometimes war might actually be morally necessary. For example, if you see an injustice, let's say it's in a neighboring country, and you have the power to stop the injustice, like a genocide in the country next door or ethnic cleansing, it would be morally necessary for you to act. But the harm that you do, and war is always harmful, must be outweighed by what's called a greater good. And war has to accord with several clear principles from which it can't depart. And they fall into two categories. These are the two categories, and they go in stages. The first one is called Ius Ad Bellum. This is in Latin. And just as Muslims use Arabic to describe everything, in the West, Latin has that function. Just about every concept that you can possibly imagine philosophically in the West has a Latin phrase to describe it. And so just war, war that is just, is called bellum justum. It has two stages. The first one is the process of getting into a war. And that's called Ius Ad Bellum, literally justice going into war. And that word use is pronounced just like that, use. War is useless. Use. The second stage is how you fight the war. Ius In Bello, which means justice during war. And the philosophers argue, in fact, that for war to remain just, it has to have justice in both stages. You have to have just reasons for going to war, and I'll show you those in a minute. And then you have to have a war that's fought cleanly, humanely, even against the combatants on the other side. It has to have both Ius Ad Bellum and Ius In Bello. Justice going into war and justice during war. This is the criteria that makes up Ius Ad Bellum, justice going into war. The first thing is you have to have a just cause. And the philosophers have always argued that ordinarily, this means self-defense. That just as an individual should protect himself from harm when he's accosted in the street or elsewhere, so does a state. A state should defend itself. It would be irresponsible of any government that has the safety and well-being of its people as a priority to let itself be overrun without fighting back. But just cause can also be, as I said, where you see injustice, perhaps, and feel, I can't sit back and let that happen. And this is something that's a bit subjective in some ways as to what constitutes a just cause. It's helped a bit by what's called right intention. Right intention means you can't have the intention of, even if there's a just cause, going to war because you want something. For example, someone else's oil. Ordinarily, the philosophers say you have to go to war to create what's called a better state of peace. War can't be perpetual. You have to go into it knowing that it's going to end and that the end state is better than the beginning state. You can't imagine a context where war would be endless. And thank God, war is never endless. You have to then go to war as a last resort. And in the age of states, which have existed since 1648, Treaty of Westphalia. Last resort means after the diplomats have tried to avoid war through some type of mediation, reaching an agreement that will take you away from war and not towards it. You have to have what's called legitimate authority. And in the age of states, states are now the central political actor in the world, states. These are normally headed by kings, not many anymore, prime ministers, presidents, sultans, amirs, people who have legitimate authority invested in them, which is accepted by the population that they govern. Legitimate authority is problematic in today's world because a lot of states are headed by dictators who are, in that sense, illegitimate. And there's over 40 dictators in the world as we speak. You have to go into war with a concept that is called proportionality, which means there's a grievance that you're going to address. You can't do more harm than is necessary to address the grievance. And in the wording of international humanitarian law, that's often said, no greater violence than needed. And the last criterion is what's called probability of success. You can't go to war if you're likely to lose it. And so that calculation is important right from the beginning. What's my likelihood of success? And if it's a possibility but not a probability, you're derelict in your responsibility to your citizens if you take them to war, knowing that success is unlikely. So those are all the reasons that you have to have before you can make the decision to go to war. When you fight the war, and I seem to have lost a page. Let me just see if it's coming here. When you go to war and
You're
begin
page
to
5,
fight,
right? Yep. Okay.
you have what's called Ius In Bello, and this involves 3 key criteria. The first one is called proportionality, which means effectively you don't use a hammer to crack a nut. You use the amount of force that's necessary to achieve the goals, which is ordinarily victory, and no more. You do no more harm than is necessary. Discrimination ordinarily is a terrible word. If you heard someone was being discriminated against, you'd say, oh, that poor person. But discrimination in international humanitarian law simply means separation out of combatants who can be harmed in war as legitimate targets of violence, and non-combatants, which is laymen call civilians. And there are different categories of both. But the general rule is that anyone that joins an armed force or a militia is fair game. They can be targeted for violence and killed accordingly. Anyone that doesn't, let's call them civilians, non-combatants is the more technical term, cannot be deliberately targeted with their death intended. And then the last thing in Ius In Bello is what's called malum in se. You can't do something evil in itself. And this again is subjective. I grew up in New Zealand, and New Zealand is a nuclear-free state. It was, in fact, the first nuclear-free state on Earth, and it took a very, very strong position against nuclear weapons, which were being tested primarily by the French in the Pacific. And it extended that dislike of nuclear weapons to include even nuclear-powered warships. That was considered by New Zealanders to be malum in se, evil in itself. Some people would say the aerial bombardment of civilians. And that's a picture of Dresden at the bottom, 13th and 14th of February 1945. The US Army Air Forces supported the Royal Air Force in massive aerial attacks on the German city of Dresden and Saxony, and in a night and a day killed perhaps 40,000 people. And that became symbolic of the power of modern warfare, the horror of modern warfare, and is considered to be malum in se. And I'll come back to this issue of something that's considered evil in itself in a minute. So these are the things that you have to have in war for a war to be just. Now, this all came to a head in, and I'll jump back 2 slides here, 1859. There was a humongous battle, a very great battle in Italy, in the north of Italy, between France and Sardinia on one side and Austria on the other. And this culminated in a battle called the Battle of Solferino, in which something like 270,000 people clashed. This is the days when they still had mostly cavalry and, of course, artillery and infantry. And of the 270, about 40,000 of these died on the battlefield. And they were literally dead and unburied on the battlefield for the afternoon after the battle. And the wounded were among them, groaning and moaning, and there was no care. And the local peasants from around came and picked out their gold fillings from their teeth and emptied their pockets and left the dead and wounded in this horrific condition. And this man, Henri Dunant, who was a Swiss Frenchman, happened to be passing through and crossed the battlefield. And this deeply religious man was so upset at the horrific state of the dead and wounded that he went and gathered a head of steam amongst his colleagues and friends that led to the creation of what's called the International Committee of the Red Cross in 1863. And now, of course, that's joined by its Islamic counterpart, the International Red Crescent. And these 2 emblems are of enormous power during war to minimize suffering. And the minimization of suffering is what it's all about. This led in 1864 to the first of the Geneva Conventions. There's a picture there of that first draft. It was then after the First World War, which was horrific in its scale, between 10 and 20 million people dead and large numbers of civilians, redrafted. The Geneva Conventions were redrafted in 1929 to try and outlaw some of the horrors of the First World War, like the use of mustard gas and other poison gases, and so on. After the Second World War, and the Second World War, 60 million people died. 27,000 humans died every single day for 6 years in the Second World War. And we lament what's happening in the world today. I saw that something like 70 people in Gaza were killed today. It's heartbreaking. Of that we can be sure. In the Second World War, 27,000 died a day, every day, endlessly for 6 years. And of the 60 million people who died, 40 million were civilians. This led in 1949 to a renewed focus on the protection of civilians in war and a redrafting of the Geneva Conventions of 1929. And then after the Vietnam War and atrocities like the My Lai massacre by the Americal Division, the American Army, in Vietnam, There were additional protocols to the Geneva Conventions in 1977. So this set of documents sits at the heart of international humanitarian law, the Geneva Conventions. And they have some functions. The primary function is to discriminate, which means to create a distinction between and to govern the treatment of these categories of people: combatants, non-combatants, prisoners of war, and refugees. And the spirit of the Geneva Conventions, which are the most wonderful documents, is what, again, in Latin, tutti fratelli, we are all brothers and sisters. We are all brothers, meaning us and the enemy. That, yes, we have a falling out at the moment, but even their lives matter. Their civilians matter. Their prisoners of war matter. To the point where, for example, if you happen to be in a battle and you take prisoners, you have to give them the same rations that you give your own soldiers. You have to make sure they have the same medical care as you give to your own soldiers, and so on. These aren't the only primary documents. In early days of industrialization, new weapons came out, like Gatling guns and high-rate machine guns. And during the American Civil War in the 1860s, Abraham Lincoln became upset at the number of people dying. The American Civil War was a horrific war, the war to end slavery. And Abraham Lincoln issued what was called the Lieber Code in 1863. This tried to ban what was called unfairly advantageous weapons or unnecessarily cruel weapons. And the Hague Conventions of 1899, and then the amended version in 1907, tried to say, how can we fight fairly and fight proportionately with weapons that kill, but kill humanely? And I'll give you an example of what I mean by that. Let's say that you get shot or you get hit by fragments of metal from a grenade or a bomb, and there are pieces of metal in your body. You can be taken into a hospital and they can x-ray you and find where that metal is inside your body and remove it. But it's now illegal in international humanitarian law to use weapons made of materials that can't be detected in x-rays. You can't use hardened plastics or different materials that wouldn't show in an x-ray. That's considered to be unnecessarily cruel. Poison gas dominated the First World War, and in 1925, the Geneva Conventions, and I think 1928 or somewhere around there, Hague Conventions, outlawed poison gases. And that prohibition has been in place for 100 years now. Thanks be to God. You imagine that. You're in a trench line in the First World War. You can't see something coming. You can't smell it. You can't taste it. You can't feel it. You just see people around you start to fall down, frothing and dying, and then you do as well. There's no reasonable means of defense against that. And because of that, it was considered to be both unfairly advantageous and unnecessarily cruel. A weapon that you can't mount a defense against simply isn't sporting. It's not fair. And so the Hague Conventions tried to capture the spirit of that and tried to say, let's make sure that the weapons people use at least have a basic humanity. Now, you might think that's kind of ironic. Ultimately, you're killing people. So what does it matter? And the answer is it does matter. It matters a great deal how people die. And the Hague Conventions are about that. The Hague Conventions also articulated the amount of violence that you can do, which is doing the minimum necessary to facilitate victory and no more. The more part would be considered to be unjust. And if it can be demonstrated that more is used and not needed, that would violate the Hague Conventions. So in a nutshell, then, we have the Geneva Conventions, which tell you who to fight, or actually more precisely who not to fight, meaning non-combatants, and the Hague Conventions, how to fight. The interesting thing about this is the United Nations consider them to be jus cogens, which is customary law. This means that states are bound to obey them regardless of the consent of the states. So, for example, the United Nations believes that the Geneva and Hague Conventions are binding on a state, even if they haven't signed and ratified them. That's the position that they take. But the interesting thing, of course, is that they don't make war illegal in itself. And this is a question that I've had put to me over the last 5 days, since the war between Israel and Iran started. Every day people have said, but attacking a country is illegal, right? And the answer is, well, no, not necessarily. War isn't even offensive war, meaning you're the attacking force, isn't in itself an illegal act. And I'll explain more about this soon. But as I mentioned earlier, the Second World War was so horrendously harmful that 60 million people dying, 40 million of them civilians, with genocides of ethnic communities and others, that the United Nations was created during the Second World War with the aim of preventing future wars happening by creating a body where states would bring their disagreements and talk it out, and where a group of states would make decisions on behalf of other states about the security of the world. It now seems rather kind of archaic, old-fashioned. Some people say it's colonial or imperial, because the United Nations, for all its wonders, and it is a wonderful organization, it does more in terms of human health, public health, and literacy than any other organization on earth. But it also has a responsibility for security, and people say it hasn't stopped the world from being so insecure. And the nature of the problem is that it's headed by a Security Council made up of the victors of the Second World War. Well, that's not really true either. France got defeated in 1940. And with all respect to the French, their contribution to the victory in the Second World War was negligible. They weren't a victor state in the sense that they were the ones defeating the enemies of the free world. China, likewise, China had suffered the most outrageous and violent occupation by Japan. In fact, well before 1939. But the other three states that are permanent members, the US, the UK, and Russia, were victors in the Second World War, and they're largely the powers that shaped the United Nations that emerged in 1945. Now, the date of this is quite important. The Charter was signed before the war ended. The war ended after Hiroshima and Nagasaki were bombed. The Japanese then surrendered in August. The Charter is signed while war is still going, and it still represents warfare conditions. I'll explain that in a minute. This is the interesting thing. How are decisions made? The Security Council sits alongside what's called the General Assembly. And in the General Assembly, every country on earth that's a member, of which there's around 195, has an equal vote. So you get a little country like New Zealand, 5 million people.
Professor, I'm sorry.
Right.
Can you? Is there a way for you to increase your volume? We're getting some messages that the volume is.
The volume?
Yes, sir.
Let's try that. Let's see if I can move that closer. Is that better?
Yes, I think so. Yeah.
I hope so. So everyone in the United Nations General Assembly has a vote, and the vote is of equal weight. So a country like New Zealand, with 5 million people, has one vote, and India, which has around 1.4 billion people, has one vote. And people say, well, that's clearly not very fair. But this is how the state-centric system was created in the 1600s. The Europeans at the Treaty of Westphalia decided that a nation's sovereignty couldn't be challenged by another, that a big state had the same right to sovereignty as a small state, and that there was an equivalency or an equality among states. And that's represented in the United Nations. Doesn't matter whether you're big or small, if you're a state, you get a vote, one vote. Everyone gets a vote. But decisions in the Security Council have to be made by an affirmative vote of 9 members, including all 5 permanent members, plus 4 others who are rotated annually. This means that actually decisions are very, very hard to make because you have, for example, the 3 most powerful states on earth at the moment are all permanent members. The United States, which has vast power. I'll give you an example. Let's take combat aircraft, air forces. America has its own Air Force, the US Air Force. Its own Army has its own Air Force, the US Army Air Force. It has a Marine Corps with an air component. It has a Navy with an air component. And together, the United States has around 50% of all the military aircraft in the entire world. That's just an example of the power of the United States. China, which is perhaps, along with India, the most populous nation on earth, a massive and growing economy, staggeringly large military, and Russia, which by comparison is about half the size of the United States, which is only something like a quarter the size of India or China. So they're all of an equal size, but those 3, and then little France and little Britain, make up the permanent members. And they seem to determine what happens in the world. And I'm pretty sure there'll be some questions on that, which I'm happy to take. But here's the key thing. The United Nations tried to make war more difficult. And it said this in Article 2, Section 4, all members shall refrain in their international relations from the use of force against these 2 things. The territorial integrity, which means effectively the borders of a country, and the political independence, which means how it's governed, of any state. So I'll read that again. All members shall refrain in their international relations from the use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state, or in any other manner inconsistent with the purposes of the United Nations. This is the statement that was supposed to prevent war. But it says shall. And that's a bit of a kind of a weaselly, wussy word. It's not a categorical prohibition, at least a clear prohibition. And there's lots of things that you can do in the use of force that don't challenge the territory of a country. You're not trying to go in and seize territory. And you're not trying to, for example, change the regime, which is kind of what this phrase means, the political independence. There's lots of things that happens in war that fall short of these. two conditions. So this statement in itself, which is supposed to be the overarching discouragement of war, isn't categorical enough. And there's a counterbalance to it, of course, which is self-defense. And this is problematic in itself. And I'll tell you why. It says that nothing in the present charter shall impair the inherent right of states to collective, individually or collective, self-defense if an armed attack occurs. If an armed attack occurs. That means it's implying that you're supposed to wait until the enemy has attacked you. Well, what if you receive information that a state has a capability to do you harm and an intention to do you harm? Are you going to wait for them to actually make their armed attack? Because that's what Article 2, Section 4 says. Beg your pardon, Article 51 says. It says, you have the right to self-defense if an armed attack occurs. But this says absolutely nothing about what we might call preemptive wars, which is when you know someone's about to attack you imminently, so you've got to do it to them before they do it to you. Or what might be called preventative wars, which is where you think they have the capacity or are developing a capacity, they have an intention. It's not yet imminent, but it might one day happen. So we have an obligation to prevent that ever happening. And this case that we see at the moment of the last 5 days of war in the Middle East isn't actually a clear case of what you might call preemption. There was no imminence involved. This was a case of prevention. It's a preventative war. And whether that satisfies Article 51 is something that's going to be long debated, I think, in hindsight. Now, here's the key thing. Who determines what's supposed to happen if an armed attack occurs? Let me just go back 1 second. It says that a state has the right to self-defense until the Security Council has taken measures to maintain international peace and security. In other words, the idea is that a state that's attacked can and should defend itself, but the Security Council will then take over the defense of that state. The interesting thing about this is, as I mentioned, the Charter of the United Nations was written early, and it's dated May 1945, while the war is still going and when there's tens of millions of Allied soldiers now fighting under the banner of the United Nations. So it says this: the Security Council shall determine the existence of any threat to the peace or breach of the peace or act of aggression, and shall make recommendations or decide what shall be done to maintain or restore international peace and security. The Security Council here may take such action by air, by sea, or land forces as may be necessary to maintain or restore international peace and security. Well, how can it? Because what happened is, as soon as the war in the Pacific ended in Japan, all of the Allied nations, the creators of the United Nations, demobbed and sent their soldiers home. Some of them had been at war for 6 years or 3 years or whatever, and tens of millions of men went home, leaving the Security Council, the United Nations, without its military, and it hasn't had one ever since. All it can do is create, as it tried to do, a kind of a banner for a war, like it did in Korea. The Korean War was fought under the banner of the United Nations, but it didn't have its own military. Now, what's all this got to do with anything? The answer is, as I said, the purpose of it all is to minimize harm during war and harm to civilians. These are my own statistics. If you go back to 400 years, to the English Civil War in the 17th century, the war killed a lot of English people, but not many civilians. About 10% were civilians, 90% were combatants. The Napoleonic Wars, where there was mass mobilization, massive armies fighting, 50,000 sometimes on one side and 40,000 on another. It increases civilian death rate to about 20%. The First World War increased it still further to 25%. The Second World War, as I mentioned, was horrific in terms of the harm to civilians. And a revulsion for civilian casualties stems from this horrific statistic. 60% of all those who died, 2/3 almost, were civilians, and only 40% were combatants. In Vietnam, it reached 65%, and Gulf War I, which happened in 1991 in January, lasted only 100 hours. 75% of the people who died were civilians and only 25% were combatants. In Gulf War II, it reached 85%. And then in the insurgencies that followed, Afghanistan and Iraq, what's called coin operations, counterinsurgency, civilian deaths were 85% of the total deaths and wounded. And only 15% were combatants. And if you look at what's happening in the current wars, you see something very similar happening as well. So who is a civilian? These non-combatants that I mentioned. Person who's not a member of an armed force, obviously. And you can identify someone who's a member of an armed force by the fact that they wear a national uniform with their country, has to be displayed on the shoulder. A person who's not a member of a civilian militia, or a person who's not involved in the planning and implementation of military violence. We've recently seen assassination of scientists, and people say, how can they kill civilians? And the argument that would be put forward is that, well, those people are involved in the planning and implementation of military violence. They're therefore no longer technically non-combatants. And we can come back to that. But civilians do include all those people that, for example, older people who aren't military age, even men who are military age but aren't part of a military, the wives, the children, obviously, people who are taken prisoner, people who are wounded. And these are the people that we have to protect in war. And Additional Protocol 1 of the Geneva Conventions, Article 48, is very, very categorical. It says the parties to the conflict shall at all times distinguish between the civilian population and combatants, and between civilian objects, which means their fields, their factories, their homes, their roads, their bridges, those cannot be targeted. You have to distinguish between those and the military objects. And accordingly, the parties to the conflict shall direct their operations only against the military people and the military things. But clearly, that's not happening. So let's look at that. The additional protocols, Protocol 1, 1977 of the Geneva Conventions, Article 51.5, says that any attack must be considered indiscriminate, this is the word, if it causes incidental loss of civilian life, injury to civilians, damage to civilian things, or any combination thereof, which would be excessive in relation to the concrete and direct military advantage anticipated. It doesn't say, actually, you can't take civilian life. It doesn't say that. It doesn't say you can't injure them. It doesn't say you can't bomb their houses. You can only do so to the level where it's not excessive in relation to the concrete and military advantage anticipated by an attack. So if, for example, you know that you're going to attack the enemy's military in such a way that lots of their civilians are going to be harmed, you can still go ahead and do that, so long as that violence to civilians and their things is not excessive in relation to the concrete and direct military advantage anticipated. So you can see, actually, there's no blanket ban on killing civilians. It's not itself a crime, a war crime, something that is automatically by itself prosecutable and punishable. If there's a directed military advantage anticipated, then you can still go ahead. And this is where something called the doctrine of double effect comes in. And in the wording of international humanitarian law, it talks about the harm done to civilians being unintended but foreseen. You're not intending to kill the civilians because they're civilians, non-combatants, but you foresee that when you attack the military, those civilians will die nonetheless. So this concept, the doctrine of double effect, allows for what's called the unintended but foreseen killing of civilians. Now, that might seem pretty horrendous. And it's this thing that militaries fall back on, or their governments, when civilians are dying. So large numbers of civilians may die, and the world may say, that's a war crime. Those civilians are being killed. Killing civilians is always wrong. But so long as it's unintended but foreseen, and it's not excessive in relation to the concrete and direct military advantage, it's actually permissible according to the Geneva Conventions. And this is the get out clause that states use. Now, let's go back to something fundamental. Why shouldn't civilians be harmed? It might seem an obvious question, but actually it's not. But there's a very reasonable answer to it. The first is that they are morally innocent. And the word innocent itself is a Latin phrase that means not doing harm. They're harmless, not doing harm. They're innocent. Well, is that true? Let me play devil's advocate for a minute and put myself into the mind of Osama bin Laden, who issued a fatwa against the Zionist state, as he called it, and American. His argument was actually it's a democracy, and that civilians vote, and civilians vote for people with policies that are announced and positions, political positions that are announced. Therefore, they know what they're voting for. Therefore, their vote creates those decisions that the democratic governments take. Therefore, in fact, they're not morally innocent. And this was a justification used for the killing of civilians. Now, that's actually contrary to the spirit of the Geneva Conventions and to just war, which says that actually civilians, even in democracies, where they do vote, and their votes count, supposedly, people are morally innocent. But certainly, let's call them civilians or non-combatants, they're weak and vulnerable. So let's take, for example, I don't know, you drive your tanks through a town, let's call it somewhere in eastern Ukraine, and there are the remnants of the civilian population there. They're people who haven't been trained to fight. They're people without weapons who can't fight. They're women, they're children, they're often old people. They are weak and vulnerable, and that weakness gives them rights, because harming them wouldn't be sporting, it wouldn't be fair. And the last reason not to attack civilians and civilian infrastructure is because it would bring about immeasurable harm if the state collapses, if the civilian society collapses. And so, for example, let's take a whole bunch of factories on, I don't know, east side of Birmingham. Amongst those factories may be factories that produce weapons, but there are factories that produce milk and factories that produce bread and factories that produce other things that humans need. And if you drop a whole lot of bombs on those things, you may destroy the armaments factories, that you make the city unlivable and humans die for lack of the things they need to sustain themselves. These are the reasons why civilians shouldn't be attacked. But the wars that we see in the world today don't happen on nice, clear battlefields away from civilians anymore. They happen in among the people. And let's take an example. Let's take a war against a terrorist group, let's call it that, or an insurgent group, an insurgent army. They're not a formal army. They don't have a formal military command structure with bases. They don't have uniforms that easily distinguish them from the rest of the population. And they live among the rest of the citizens. And this was a great problem, for example, when Western forces and others went into Afghanistan, supposedly to fight the Taliban. Is that, well, who is the Taliban? How do you know who the Taliban is? You go on patrol through Helmand province, you go past some farmers, they've got AK-47s slung over their shoulders, but they don't fire upon you. So you presume, well, thank God for that, they're not Taliban. But they might be. And certainly the accusation is that, well, they hide behind the civilians. And when we fight them, the civilians die. So what is the law of war about this? About the separation of combatants from the people, the rest of the population? Well, the Geneva Conventions are very clear that you are prohibited from deliberately placing civilians around military things, like a military base, to protect them from attack. You're not allowed to have a military base, military assets, weapons, armed forces within or near densely populated areas. You're not allowed, certainly, to place military things within or even next to places of worship like synagogues and mosques and churches and temples. You're not allowed to place them within hospitals, either soldiers or their things, in hospitals, schools, or sites of cultural importance. And the accusation in recent wars is that, I don't know, let's call it Hamas. Well, Hamas are fighting from within hospitals, within schools, within sites of cultural importance. So if we have to destroy those, it's because we're fighting Hamas. Well, as I said, Additional Protocol 1 of Geneva Conventions prohibits the deliberate placing of military people or military things in or next to religious sites, hospitals, schools, and cultural sites. That's a fact. It's wrong to do that. But let's say that somebody does. Let's say that whoever it is, let's not call them Hamas, let's call them anything. Let's say they are putting their combatants in mosques or synagogues or temples or churches or hospitals or schools. What does the law say about that? The law is very clear. The responsibility for protecting civilians is this. Article 50, Section 3 of Additional Protocol 1 of Geneva Convention says, even the presence of unjust fighters or their stuff, quote, does not deprive the civilian population of its civilian character, which means even if an insurgent group is seen to be fighting from within a mosque or a hospital or a school, you may not strike it. The attacker has the responsibility to protect those things and the civilians that are around them and that use them. This is one of the things that upsets me perhaps the most about the current wars that we see, is that this seems to be flagrantly and routinely violated. People look at the first half of it. They say, well, they're not supposed to be there. That group's not supposed to be hiding in a mosque. It's their choice, and they pay the price for it, or in a hospital or school. But the Geneva Conventions doesn't allow that. It's very, very clear that even doing those things does not deprive the civilian population of its civilian character. Therefore, the attacker, regardless of the inappropriate actions of the defender, it's the attacker who has the responsibility to protect the civilians. So, the last thing I want to talk about just quickly is something that I get asked about, well, I have been asked about every morning when I wake up and I check my emails, how evil it is that people are being assassinated. And you see a quote even from President Trump, who said this: we know exactly where the so-called supreme leader is. This is meaning the Iranian supreme leader. He's an easy target, but he's safe there. We're not going to take him out, kill, at least not for now. And I've got a couple of examples of the fact that you see a lot of Iran's officials have been targeted and killed. Politicians, military officers, scientists, and others. People are outraged by that and say that's That must be criminal. That must be wrong. Actually, assassination isn't by itself a criminal act. So, for example, let's say that you know where the supreme leader is, and you fire a missile into that building to kill him. That is no more illegal in itself than, for example, if we had in the Second World War information of where Hitler was. And please don't think I'm making any comparison between the supreme leader of Iran and the leader of Nazi Germany. God forbid, no comparison whatsoever. I'm just trying to make the point. That's how it would have been justified had the British or the Americans dropped a bomb on Hitler's headquarters. Killing somebody, even the leader of the state that you're at war with, as what we would call an assassination, isn't in itself criminal unless perfidy is involved. And perfidy is a very, very old-fashioned word. I'm pretty sure that most people watching me will have no idea what it means. And I tried to kind of think of a synonym for it. What does it mean? What's a word that's the equivalent? And there isn't a single word that sums it up, but it means something like unusually dishonorable, sneaky, cunning, deceitful, cravenly, wicked deception. So, what does the Geneva Convention say about this? It says perfidy means, for example, pretending to negotiate under a white flag, or pretending to surrender and then killing somebody. That would be an act of perfidy. The feigning of incapacitation. So you pretend you're lying there, and then you suddenly pull out your weapon and kill somebody who's coming to your aid. Claiming to be a civilian or a non-combatant, when in fact you are a combatant. Or wearing somebody else's uniform. These sorts of things are all acts of perfidy. And you can't assassinate somebody as an act of perfidy. There's no other prohibition apart from within state laws. And a lot of states now have laws against assassination of overseas leaders. Thanks be to God. But in terms of international humanitarian law, it's not itself criminal or prosecutable or punishable. So, got to the end. The obvious question is, well, this is all good and well. So, there's all of this moral concern about civilians during war, about the need even to look after prisoners of war, the minimization of violence, proportionality. Why aren't people obeying? And this is what people say, well, no one obeys the Geneva Conventions. Yeah, they do. At the moment, there's about 195 sovereign states on Earth as member states of the United Nations. And less than 10, as we speak, I would assess to be violating the Geneva Conventions. The other 185 or so are compliant. People speed in their car even though there are laws that say you shouldn't. But you have speeding laws for a reason, because it minimizes harm, and most people comply most of the time. And this is the same with international humanitarian law. Most of the world is not conducting atrocious acts of violence against each other. Thanks be to God. But somehow, So what should happen to those? Well, it's a bit tricky. So after the Second World War, we captured a whole bunch of leading Nazis and Imperial Japanese leaders. And in two big tribunals, one in Tokyo and, of course, the famous one in Nuremberg, we put them on trial. And the trials were based on Anglo-American law and based on things like what's called ex post facto prosecutions. We prosecuted them for things that hadn't been criminal when they committed them. So, for example, there was no such thing as a crime against aggression, crimes against humanity. These are things that we prosecuted them for that didn't exist in law. But we went ahead and did it anyway, ex post facto. We also refused to allow what's called a tu quoque defense, which means, well, you did it also. So at Nuremberg and at Tokyo, the Germans and the Japanese weren't able to say, well, okay, so you're trying us for this, but you did it. And if law means anything, it has to be fair. And there was a great deal of consternation about whether this was therefore fair. But the horrors of the Second World War were so great, that in the 3 years following it, 4 years following it, a whole bunch of new international law emerged. And it tightened up some of those kind of dubious things that were attributed to the Nuremberg trial. We had, for example, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, 1948, which established the rights of every individual as opposed to states, and said what the rights of humans are, which includes, obviously, life, freedom from slavery, the right to be educated, the right to be properly fed, and so on. There was the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of Genocide, 1948, for the first time, that made the killing of a people an international crime. There were new laws on laws of the sea. There were the Geneva Conventions of 1949 to protect civilians, the additional protocols after Vietnam of 1977. And the United Nations itself created what's called a Court of Justice. But here's the thing about the Court of Justice, is that it only can try a state on an issue, but it can't try an individual. And so, for example, in the Second World War, if there had been a Court of Justice, it would have found Nazi Germany guilty of crimes of inhumanity and crimes of aggression. But the individuals involved, the Goerings, Hitler was obviously dead, and the Nazi generals and so on, can't be prosecuted in the International Court of Justice. This has caused a big problem. In 1993, this is following the Yugoslav disintegration, the International Criminal Tribunal was established to try people for ethnic cleansing and all sorts of horrific things. After the horrors of Rwanda, the United Nations created a special tribunal for that. But they said, we need something that will actually try individuals and that isn't context specific, that will try criminality anywhere. And in 1999, they created in The Hague what's called the International Criminal Court to try individuals. And the logic was, wherever you are, if you commit a crime, you can be prosecuted for it. And when they set this up, it was set up by what was called the Rome Statute, and wasn't part of the United Nations, although it's supported by the United Nations. Some countries chose to vote against it, and then not to sign it and not to ratify it. And 7 countries voted against the International Criminal Court. And it's interesting if you look at who they were and who they included. The US, China, Iraq, Israel, Libya, Qatar, and Yemen. But the good news is, that's the bad news. The good news is most of the world has now signed it and ratified it, which means they're bound by it. The International Criminal Court is pretty much like Nuremberg, but without its flaws. Nuremberg had legal flaws. That was the first time something like that had been done. This had got rid of those flaws, and it can try people for crimes of genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes. And in 2010, they added the crime of aggression. And you think, aha, aggression means attacking another nation. This must be applicable to this discussion. Come back to that. And in 2018, that extra charge of aggression was rolled out. But while 100 and I think, as you know, 43 countries have signed and ratified the Rome Statute and are therefore bound by the rules and regulations of the International Criminal Court, only 43 signed and ratified the addition of aggressive war as a criminal act, which means that at the moment, the ICC, International Criminal Court, isn't really prosecuting people for aggression. Now, the second thing about this is it's really hard to charge somebody and get them convicted. And I'll tell you why. The International Criminal Court is a secondary court. It's designed to complement national law. The logic of it is that a country will hand over its own criminals to be tried and prosecuted and maybe convicted. What country hands over its war criminals? What country admits that its acts are criminal? What country that goes to war then retrospectively says, oh gosh, we shouldn't have done that. We better hand them over to the International Criminal Court. So this happens almost never. It normally only happens when, for example, a dictator gets replaced by another dictator. And that dictator says, how do I get rid of my predecessor? I'll stick him in the Hague and he can go to the International Criminal Court. States don't behave this way. And asking states to hand over, to objectively reflect on their conduct, say, did we commit war crimes? Oh gosh, we did. That person's guilty. He needs to be handed over to the International Criminal Court. This almost never happens. Now, the other way that someone can be prosecuted is if the Security Council itself of the United Nations recommends a prosecution. But don't forget what I said at the beginning. The world's great powers are all on the Security Council. And so if you look at the current wars and who's involved or who's been involved in wars throughout the last decades, they include permanent members of the Security Council. So you've got Britain, and you've got America, and you've got Russia, and now you've got, and China, and of course, France. And the last thing about the International Criminal Court is you have to have signed and ratified it, the treaty, the Rome Statute, for it actually to be binding on you. So, who hasn't? Well, has Russia? No. Has Ukraine. Ukraine this year has signed and ratified and is now a party to the Rome Statute and is therefore what? A party to the International Criminal Court. Only now because of the hope that Russia might be prosecuted and Putin might one day end up in the dock. Well, how's that going to happen? Russia itself isn't party. It's signed, but never ratified. So let's look at who else is at war at the moment. Israel and Iran. Neither countries have signed and ratified. Both countries signed, but never ratified the Rome Statute. So they're not party to the International Criminal Court. And unless a crime happens in a state that is party, or the crime is conducted by someone who has both signed and ratified, no prosecutions can be brought against them. So if you think about the world we live in, you've got Israel, you've got Iran, you've got the United States, and you've got Russia, who are not party to the International Criminal Court. It's the most extraordinary situation to have, where we have a court designed to try war crimes, and these countries are effectively exempt. Now, it goes even further than that. Let's take the case of America. America objects so fundamentally to the International Criminal Court that it has gone to a lot of countries, particularly countries in Africa, South America, countries that it gives foreign aid to, and has demanded of them the signing of what's called bilateral immunity clauses, which means those countries are told, if you don't sign this, we may reduce the foreign aid that you receive. And signing it means that if an American commits a crime on your soil, he is not to be prosecuted by the International Criminal Court for it. You have to agree to this. Around 100 countries on earth have signed with America bilateral immunity agreements exempting Americans who commit acts of criminality in their countries from the possibility of being convicted or being taken to the International Criminal Court for prosecution. So it's both a pleasing story. The world does care about the harm that war brings. It created a body of wonderful laws to try and minimize that harm. But all of the laws have what you might call get-out clauses. So, for example, the Charter of the United Nations talks about armed attack and says that you have the right to self-defense. But it doesn't say anything about preemption, let alone prevention, preemptive attacks or preventative attacks. The Geneva Conventions themselves, which are fabulous and have undoubtedly done a lot to protect civilians theoretically. You saw that around 85% of people that die in wars, even since the additional protocol Geneva Conventions of 1977, 85% of the people dying in war remain civilians. Why? Because of concepts like the concept of double effect, the idea that you can create what you justify as unintended but foreseen deaths of civilians, where you know that you're attacking the enemy, but the collateral damage can be very large scale, so long as it's not disproportionate in terms of the military goal to be achieved. So it's both a positive story and a negative story. in terms of the way international law should limit war and the limitations on the way it actually does limit war. And with that, I'll turn it back to you. And I imagine you've got a whole stack of wonderful questions for me.
Thank you so much, Professor, for such a detailed and very informative education on international law and what it entails and what it does not. And as you said, there were like so many different topics that we were discussing. Um, Essentially, uh, there's a lot of questions that I have, but I don't know how much time we have. So what essentially I think what it means to is, um, or the way I think uh, they kind of like came about, like the way the three kind of like categories as we were talking, I was writing things down. And one is, as you mentioned, the change of battlefield and the weaponry, right? So I think the chart that you showed in your PowerPoint, uh, you know, right after World War One to say like World War Two, where we have these weapons of, I would call them mass destruction. The battlefield change, right? The battlefield is everywhere now, right? And the with the air warfare, right? The main difference between, probably like in the 20th century has been the air warfare compared to the previous warfare, though, like, marine warfare is another thing. But point being is that strategically the battlefield has changed, weaponry has changed, the tactic has changed, and now we have the automated remote warfare, which is autonomous, and you can just, based on AI, you have these uh, tools, weaponry, and going towards, you program them, they operate independently. So that is, I guess, more of a technical or strategic issue rather than probably like a law issue. But I wanted to kind of like get that over first. And what are your thoughts on that? And if that could be tackled with, or that could be somehow changed.
Well, some things are legal. For example, the people who convened to revise the Geneva Conventions are, even as we speak, looking at the international criminality of what's called cyber warfare. Cyber warfare is where electronically you hack into another state's systems to disrupt their services, close down their banking systems, turn off their traffic lights, cause societal chaos. And this isn't covered yet in any international humanitarian law, but the consequences of it can be very great. So, for example, you imagine if someone hacked into the street lighting system of Manchester in Britain, and all of the lights went to green, and cars panic and don't know how to drive and crash into each other, and humans die. Or you shut down the banking in a country and people can't get even $10 from an ATM to buy their bread and milk. These are enormously harmful actions. Then you have weapons like, for example, drones. And in the war in Ukraine, for example, the Russians and the Ukrainians have both attempted to make advances using main battle tanks. And the main battle tanks used to be the dominant weapons on the battlefield.
Hmm.
And they no longer are. They're absolutely prone to something that's only 4 feet wide and costs $500 to make, that can fly above a tank and drop an ordnance on it and destroy it. And so you see in Russia and Ukraine now, the tanks on both sides have these huge metal structures built on them with wire grills above them and around them to try and stop projectiles from drones from destroying a tank that costs tens of millions of dollars. And so those weapons are being mostly held back. You've got to the position where now you have drones flying above individual soldiers on the ground and dropping a grenade-sized ordnance on them and killing them. They see them coming, and you've got soldiers now surrendering to a drone. They put their hands up, and in international law, this putting the hands up, exposing the two palms, means that you cannot take the life of that person. But the drones are, and they're releasing their ordnance on people who are trying to surrender to them. And the moral justification is, well, they're not surrendering to a person, they're surrendering to a machine. And then you have what you call autonomous weapons, which are quite scary. Some of them aren't. So let's say that you're on a frigate or a destroyer, and the enemy sends an anti-shipping missile through the air at you at some horrendous speed, faster than someone in a radar room can track it and react to it, turn a weapon back against it. It's pretty good if you've got a Gatling gun or some other anti-air system that can autonomously, be, in the blink of an eye before a human can act, can shoot down that incoming missile before even anyone's noticed it. That's how quickly they can respond. That seems pretty good. But autonomy also takes the human decision out of war. And if it's not a human making a decision, is it actually a moral decision to take a life? And it's a very complex philosophical debate going on about air power, whether you actually need, for example, in a ground attack aircraft or a fighter interceptor, a pilot at all. Humans have slow reactions. The quickest we can make is something like a quarter of a second. Our mind is slow. Our eye-to-hand coordination is even slower. A machine is so much faster. So why bother putting a human in a cockpit? And humans, of course, are prone to G-forces. We can't sustain more than 6 or 7 Gs. Even with a G-suit, you can hardly go above that. And yet a machine without a pilot can fly through much heavier G-forces than a human can. So why put a human in an aircraft anymore? And if you happen to be, let's say, the chief of an air force, let's say it's the chief of the air staff of the Royal Air Force in Britain, or the chief of Air Force in the US or Pakistan or India or Bangladesh, your highest responsibility is to save the lives of your personnel. Why would you want to fly manned missions or womened missions if you can simply do the same job with machines? And so there's a moral question about that. And you see that increasingly piloted aircraft are being replaced by unpiloted aircraft. And we are moving towards the days when we will have even 5th and 6th generation fighter aircraft unpersoned soon. And then you think, well, that's all a bit like Terminator, isn't it? Where you've got machines killing machines. How human is that? The answer is, well, actually, I'd prefer machines to kill machines than people to kill people, to be honest. But it's what happens if machines, without a human, decide to kill humans. And that's the kind of Terminator syndrome. That's pretty scary.
The dark side of AI.
It really is. Weapons, you know, there are certain turning points. Hiroshima in August 1945 was undoubtedly a turning point. Hiroshima, and then later in the same week in Nagasaki, you drop a bomb in a millisecond, you've wiped out 70,000 people. It can't discriminate. It can't say, well, that's an old lady, that's a child. That's an old man in a wheelchair or in his bed in an old people's home. It cannot discriminate, it kills everybody. Yet, you have a number of countries now with the nuclear weapon. You have France and Britain and Israel and India and Pakistan and America and Russia and North Korea, all with weapons that cannot possibly be used discriminately, absenting the non-combatants from harm. The only thing I would say about that is, to date, after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, a great taboo surrounding the nuclear weapon, the atomic weapon it was before that, has emerged, and that has remained for 85 years and is still in force, where that's seen as an act of evil in itself. The word I used earlier was malamense. In the Cold War, both sides had tens of thousands of nuclear weapons, the Warsaw Pact and NATO. And the reason why they didn't use them was because of what was called mutually assured destruction. The certainty that if one side used them, the other side would too, and it would be the end of humanity. That's both frightening and reassuring. But what if those sorts of weapons fall into the hands of someone who's apocalyptical, who believes that God is intending this generation to be the last ever before the day of judgment, and that ushering that in can only be a good thing? And they have an enemy. Imagine that. And they get their hands on a nuclear weapon. That's pretty scary.
Mm.
But I did mention that the world is trying. Most of the world has moved away from landmines. So landmine is something that looks like a frisbee. It's hidden in the ground. Soldiers that walk across it are detonated. It blows their legs off, ordinarily kills them, or a vehicle. And most of the world has now abandoned what's called cluster munitions.
Mm.
Cluster munitions are small bombs that, as they drop towards the ground, open up, and small bomblets the size of golf balls come out of it and spread across the ground. And they're normally pink or yellow. And they scatter across the ground, and if someone stands on one, they explode. Hundreds of millions of these have been spread across the earth, and they look like something that kids would pick up. And guess what? That's what happens. Kids pick them up, and they get killed by them, and they pollute farmers' fields, and farmers who are out plowing their fields, sowing seeds, get their legs blown off by them. The world has said that's unjust, and they've made that criminal. And so international humanitarian law has banned the use of landmines and cluster munitions for those countries that sign and ratify those treaties. And some countries haven't. For example, the United States and Russia and others.
That's like the actual, I think the issue that everybody is facing or discussing overall in the world is, um, true justice, like versus the legalism and the litigation of law and the manipulation of law for one or the other, and to justify the war they're doing. So I definitely want to come back to that point. But as you mentioned earlier, we were just talking about it where you ended almost your lecture, is you mentioned that most of the countries in the world, they are not um, at war, right? But the impact is
Right.
being made by those 5 or 10 countries or whatever countries that have been for the past 100 or 200 years, right? Since the World War I, World War II, and whatnot. So it is not, as you said, like the war is a tool of justice, but it's also a tool of injustice, inversely, right? And two, if you want peace, prepare for war. Like if everybody, and that is again, a cliche to have. But at the same time, the problem with law, any kind of law, even like, within nation, is how do you enforce the law on the lawmakers? And that is particularly the issue, particularly when we are talking about, the United Nations, and particularly the P5 and the veto power that they have, and the, practical immunity they have, not only because of legality of these conventions. As you mentioned, some of them have not signed the ICC, but also the political, economical coercion that they have, in addition to the military coercion that they have. So I think that is what everybody's trying to see, is that this uh, uh, for a lack of better word, hypocrisy, if you will. That the people who make the law, does the law apply to them?
I,
Both
I,
in the general context, and also of this context of like international law, if you will.
some things get better and some things get worse. 1968, there was a battalion or several platoons of what was called the Americal Division. And in Vietnam, these Americans went into a village called My Lai. And the people of My Lai, in this, what we would, in old-fashioned terms, call a peasant village, had been giving support to their compatriots, the Viet Cong. And the Americans went in there and rounded up these people, civilians, and killed nearly 500 of them. They threw babies up in the air and caught them on their bayonets. They killed women, children, old people. And of all those involved, only one person was ever prosecuted, Lieutenant Cowley, and he was subsequently pardoned. Well, jump forward to the American invasion of Iraq. The Americans captured lots of what they considered bad people and put them into jails and patrolled them with military personnel, including in a prison called Abu Ghraib, where they, on their phone cameras, like we all have, filmed each other humiliating and even torturing some of the prisoners. They were prosecuted and punished. So you think, well, there you go, you've got progress. Then, to contrast that, you've got Guantanamo Bay, which is an American outpost on the island that houses Cuba, where Americans took people suspected of criminality and without due process locked them sometimes for years in terrible, terrible conditions. At the same time as they are prosecuting people for injustice in Abu Ghraib. So good things happen, bad things happen, sometimes by the same people. But are things getting better? I think in balance, yes. The world used to be in perpetual conflict. Every people at some point was at war with the people around them. It was constant, and it was the nature of humanity. Warfare was the default setting for humans. Now, thanks be to God, peace is a default setting of humans. And as I mentioned, most states are unaffected by war right now. Most states. The overwhelming majority, 90% of the world, isn't suffering directly from the effects of warfare. So something's changed. Yet, in those states where war is occurring, the number of deaths of civilians is around 85% of the total. Combatants, 15%. And that isn't because of high velocity weaponry or the product of industrialization. There's something inherently cruel about humans and war seems to bring out the worst of us. And especially when you can get away with wrongdoing, sometimes people take that opportunity and do it for all sorts of terrible reasons. Sometimes for religious reasons, sometimes for ethnic reasons, sometimes for cultural or social reasons. And that hasn't disappeared from humanity. But I go back to the point I make. It's better to have laws that most people comply with, even if some don't, than to have no laws to set a benchmark and to hold people accountable to.
Yes, Professor, but again, when we're talking about warfare, it is between states, it's not between the individuals, right? But eventually, like we have sanctions or such things between the states. Whenever someone has law, you have to have enforcement ability, right? And that is one of the things that you did point out during your lecture, that the Security Council of the United Nations or ICC or ICJ, they don't have enforcement mechanisms. They don't have enforcement forces. And
They
in
do.
essence, it just becomes ineffective because yes, there may be laws, but like the only people the laws apply to are the ones who probably are not violating the laws.
The expectation is that states themselves that have consciences will prosecute their own people for wrongdoing. That's the logic inherent in, for example, the Rome Statute, the basis of the International Criminal Court. It's there to try to prosecute people in states that won't prosecute their wrongdoers. But most don't.
Hmm.
Most
Right. So,
simply don't. So let's say that you're, I don't know, an African country where something horrific happens. Why do I say that? I'll tell you why I say that and say Africa. Because the only cases I think before the International Criminal Court at the moment are of crimes in Africa. And the accusation, therefore, is there's something inherently colonial or perhaps
hmm,
even racist about the International Criminal Court, in that, with one or two exceptions, everybody sent to the International Criminal Court tends to be non-white European or non-white Western. And that's something of a sad reality. It needs explaining and unpacking. I don't think it's purely to do with colonialism or the remnants of it or racism. It's more complex than that. But it does seem to be something that needs addressing. By nature, the International Criminal Court is global. It has 18 judges that sit at a time. They're drawn from all over the world. They try to make sure that on every occasion, the 18 are representative of every part of the world. Rich countries, poor countries, Western countries, non-Western countries, Africans, South Americans, Asians. But that isn't seeming to address the issue that I mentioned. And it certainly needs to be addressed. And like I say, there's something wrong. You see, you imagine if you get pulled over by a traffic cop and you say, I don't recognize your authority. I've never signed up to the speeding law. Policeman will say, I do not care. You sped, the law covers you. Here's your ticket.
so
The International Criminal Court isn't based on that logic. It's based on a logic that it's applicable only to the states that have signed and ratified its statute. And as I mentioned, neither Israel nor Iran in that war. The US hasn't. I don't even think, to be honest, the US has signed and ratified the Geneva Conventions, although it might be old knowledge, I might be out of date. And only this year did Ukraine finally sign and ratify the Rome Statute for the International Criminal Court. Now, let's say that the International Criminal Court does issue a warrant, an arrest warrant for Netanyahu, for Vladimir Putin, for some other person. How would that be enforced? It would only be enforceable if that person then traveled to a country that was a signatory and a ratifier of the Rome Statute, who thought justice demands that I arrest that person.
And
It
also, if
wasn't
they do not have the immunity law that you just mentioned, right? What was that called? Bilateral,
bilateral immunity.
right? So if any country, yep.
So
So this is very interesting, Professor. I'm sorry to interrupt because there are like really so many questions, but I think like I have somehow uh, put them down into three some categories, and didn't mean to interrupt, but I didn't want to lose the thought. In international law, there was, you mentioned, well, we can argue there's nothing to be mentioned about, war, and we will talk a little bit about Article 51. So the initiation of the war, and a lot of that deals with what happens during the war, how you conduct a war. So there isn't like there's a lot of ambiguity how to start a war, and then there's some processes of or some ethics and rules about how to conduct a war, but there isn't any rules post-war. Rather, like to say the prisoners of war or how one country would compensate another country if the war was defined to be unjust, and if those people who committed, let's say, because of, for example, if and ICC case has ICC has um, ruled that there's a probable cause for a genocide there, legally speaking, right? And so if it does, then um, there's no post-war enforcement or for that.
in just war theory, they have what's called Ius Post Bellum, which is a category that's now emerging to try to deal with the period after a war has finished,
Mm,
where compensation
mm,
uh, is ensured to make sure that there's some type of restorative mechanism. In international humanitarian law, that doesn't exist. The philosophy should be you break it, you pay for it. So you bomb the heck out of a country to achieve whatever national aims you have. Let's say you've got a powerful air force and you're bombing Serbia, 1999, to try and force Serbia to release from its clutches Kosovo and Metohija.
mm,
You bomb the two biggest oil refineries in Europe, Pančevo and Novi Sad, as America and Britain did, and left them in ruins. And they think, well, good job. They don't realize what they've done to that country and the damage that that does. But I do think that something good has happened in terms of international law, international humanitarian law, is that it now considers the environment and the physical environment, ecology. So when I was young, I don't remember how old I was, a young man, a ship called the Exxon Valdez uh, struck a run aground off the coast of Alaska and spilled 40,000 tons of crude oil into the coastal waters. Did terrible, terrible damage. Well, in the Second World War, we sank a German ship, or they sank one of ours, with submarines or with other vessels. We sank that much water, that much oil into the bottom of the ocean every week for 6 years. Think about after the Second World War finished, and the Americans and the British have got millions of artillery shells, landmines, and other weapons. It's never ever going to use that many again. What did we do with them? Well, in the case of the United Kingdom, it took them by warship and dumped them into the Irish Straits and the North Sea. And all of that stuff and its toxic effect is littering the bottom of the ocean to this day. So we have now created international laws of war that prevent that. We've got laws on even the modification of the environment during war. So the Americans used what was called Agent Orange to defoliate, to deforest parts of Vietnam so that it could see where the enemy was. After that, the international legal community passed laws that the world has signed and ratified, making such things illegal to permanently modify the environment for the purposes of war. So actually, it's not all bad, despite the fact that even as we speak, missiles are falling upon areas where there are no known military assets or people. But the way we look at these things is also a bit hypocritical, to be honest. So we in the West have taken a position, for example, Europeans in particular, about old Europe, about Russia. We delight in putting in our newspapers every day the stories that Russia has destroyed these many apartment buildings in Kyiv, the capital of Ukraine, destroying civilian infrastructure. Oh, these terrible Russians. Well, what do you think the Ukrainians are doing to Russia? There's a large bridge that goes across what's called the Kerch Straits that joins the Caucasus, part of Russia, to the Crimean Peninsula. The Russians have built it at enormous cost. It's not a load-bearing bridge that can take military tanks and equipment. It doesn't have a dual use. It's therefore off limits to military targeting. Yet when Ukraine blows a hole in it, or underwater blows up one of its pylons that hold it up, we take pride in that and think, gosh, these crafty Ukrainians, how brilliant. So that subjective approach to war is something that international law tries to get beyond. It's saying it doesn't matter who does it, friend or foe, it shouldn't be done. Now, again, that doesn't guarantee compliance. But the fact that justice is blind, and you know the symbol of justice is the woman holding the scales with a blindfold, applies to war as well. It doesn't matter whether it's friend or foe, you shouldn't do it. But one of the interesting things about war is that whatever you do to your enemy, they'll do to you. So if you maltreat your prisoners and your own personnel fall into their hands, guess what they'll do? Exactly what you've done to theirs.
Or worse.
There's always this kind of spiraling violence in war that international law tries to stop. It just says, don't do it at all. And as I said, it's better to have laws that most people follow, even if some people don't, than to have no standards and no laws at all.
Professor, there's three more questions. I know you're probably tired too. I don't know. Like, please let me know if it is getting too tired. I have three main questions before I want to deal with. Is one is the non-state actors, right? And we have seen that, and there's a distinction between, and there's a transition as well, like throughout history, right? You look at IRA, you look at, the African National Congress, and, the distinction between the freedom fighters versus, the insurgents, right? And has been like, change of, and like, you talked about, the Russian war in the 80s versus the Taliban's in the 90s and the 200s, in the 80s, they were the heroes. In the later decades, they became, the villains. So there has always been, it seems like, or not seems like, it is, that there is this dichotomy of ethics, if you will, and whereas when we talk about non-state actors and international law, since they are non-state actors, or what we call state actors. Now, when you talk about international law, a lot of states in the world do not recognize Israel as a state. Is that a non-state actor? So all of these things, how do we how to make sense of all of this?
Well, insurgents are people that take exception to their own government. They think their government has been non-representative or exploitative or ideologically unacceptable. So a groundswell from the population emerges. People rise up against the government.
Hmm.
They surge, like insurgents, people that rise up. That's what the word insurge means, to rise up.
Hmm.
Almost always throughout history, insurgents have fought in a morally just fashion and haven't killed civilians. Why would they? They're their compatriots. And even when government forces fall into their own hands, they don't commit atrocities against them. They ordinarily take them prisoner and treat them well. And insurgents almost always succeed. Counterinsurgency is about the most difficult kind of war there is, and the odds of winning aren't great. And some examples of that, of course, Cuba with Castro, but America with George Washington. George Washington's one of history's great insurgent victors. Oliver Cromwell was another, the great protector. So you see that even in the English Civil War and the American Civil War, we call it the American Revolution, these are cases of successful insurgents where the freedom fighters or the people who saw their governments as unjust rose up. The government said they're illegitimate and tried to suppress them, and the insurgents won. Another case in point is Malaysia.
Hmm.
In the 1940s and 50s, in an anti-colonial struggle, the Malaysians said, we have the right to self-determination and an end to British control. The British said, oh, no, you don't. And they called them CTs, communist terrorists. That was the phrase that was used, CTs. Well, guess who won?
The
Because
freedom fighters.
the Malaysians are a vibrant, prosperous, and very peaceful people. The fact that they gained their freedom through a freedom struggle, through violence, doesn't make them a violent people.
That is a
So
just war, isn't
honestly,
it? That is a
it's
just war, if you will.
so war has these ironies. I think the key lesson is that it's right for humans to live in freedom, not to live as slaves, not to live in occupation, and that people deserve to be able to make their decisions. And when they can't, they will rebel against that. It's a certainty. It's as inevitable as anything you can imagine. And if you happen to be an occupying power, you know your chances of long-term success are almost nil.
Hmm.
So you're better not to start it.
Hmm.
And I think
That's a
I
very
think that
interesting
itself
point.
is a very positive thing.
Oh, that is a
Uh,
very, very critical point that you mentioned. And, you're right. If you look out through history in the long game, you know, even if you're powerful, but like, as you said, like the revolutionaries or the insurgents, they will win. And, that is, again, we were talking about international court and we were talking about prosecution of people rather than the state, right? And essentially what it means is self policing, as we call it, by the states. So I mean, the reason I wanted to bring that up is the distinction between the international law and the non-state actors, and there isn't like that kind of ambiguity of all of these like what we consider to the non-state actors,
I
and
think that in future, international humanitarian law will be modified to include non-state actors. It's starting to
mhm,
be. At the
mhm,
moment, the main actor in international affairs is still the state itself,
mhm.
and has been for 400 years. And it's changing.
That's you're right. So again, going back to that 400 years you just mentioned, as you mentioned as well, that this all of the international law that we are talking about is based on the European history and on their legacy going all the way, the 80-year war, the Westphalian Treaty and all of that. Uh, and the context and the moral and ethics of that is again kind of like being proposed around the world, and that's just part of the power politics, right? So that is one of the things that that we are coming back to again and again is this Anglo-American law, or historically that's been like Anglo-American law that um, was implemented by the victors of World War II. And you did mention at some point that, okay, they were not all victors, but they were all allies, right? So when we are fighting a war, they're all allies. If they all win, they're all part of the victors. And those victors kind of like immune themselves from the law by being in the P5 and the veto. And that kind of like creates that double, that injustice, if you will. Seems because as we talk about it, is there's legalism. There was a time slavery was legal, right? And historically that has been. Um, it's just been recently that one could argue whether human trafficking right now falls under that or not. But again, point being is just law versus unjust law, whether what is right and what is wrong. And after just after this point, I have a few questions about Article 51, and I want to
Let
point
me
a
just
few things.
address that quickly. You know, I've been a Muslim for a long time now.
Hmm,
When I first became a Muslim, because I study and teach and write on the ethics of war and international humanitarian law, when I first became a Muslim, I thought, well, Islam emerged in late antiquity. It was a barbarous time. And I bet you the early Muslims were no different than the other tribal societies around the world, where life was held in low regard or was considered to be profane and not sacred. I began to look into it intellectually and was pretty shocked, actually, to find that the life of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him himself, involved war that was extremely just and low casualty. And I mentioned 27,000 people dying a day in the Second World War. We call that a good war, that good war. Well, the Prophet fought a whole lot of wars for 10 years, and 354 people died
so,
in 10
uh,
years, 35 a year. And we have a saying in the West that Islam spread by the sword. Well, not in the lifetime of the Holy Prophet Muhammad, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Then you jump forward to the time when, looking back on that, the Islamic jurists said, well, how should we fight wars? And so you see, for example, Shaybani, the great scholar of Siyah, of international law. He writes a book, the Kitab Siyah al-Kabir, the greater book of international law. And you read this, you feel like you're reading the Geneva Conventions, or you read something like uh, Sulami's Kitab al-Jihad,
hmm,
and that was written 1,000 years ago, around the same time as the Norman Conquest, 1066. It was written around that same period. You read that and you think, I'm reading the Geneva Conventions. The
hmm,
war, the codes of war in Islam, they haven't always been followed. Got to say that. I mean, people
that's true.
in the Islamic empires haven't always done as they should either. But theoretically, based on the Sunnah of the Holy Prophet Muhammad sallam, and based on the fiqh, the Sharia that emerged, war is supposed to involve minimal harm,
Hmm,
even to the combatants on the other side, to the civilians on both sides. It's supposed to be clean and humane and discriminate, meaning that no harm is supposed to be done to children, to women, to non-combatants, to old people, to prisoners of war, to the wounded. Uh, I wrote a small book, in fact, on it. I think you put it on the cover of the poster about civilian immunity in Islam. You
hmm,
read it, you map it over modern 20th century, 21st century international humanitarian law, and it fits hand in glove. And that emerged 1,200 years ago based on the Sunnah of the Prophet, peace be upon him, 1,400 years ago. So it's not me just saying the West are the only contributors to to ideas on humanity during war. But it's certainly true that the 20th century was dominated by the victors of the Second World War, and they drew upon their tradition, primarily the European tradition, going all the way back, like I said, to Cicero in Rome, or St. Augustine, or Thomas Aquinas. Very Christian, very Western. Yet actually, the Islamic concepts of war are pretty much the same. They're not described in the same terms. You don't talk about Ius Ad Bellum, Ius In Bello. But the concepts that war in Islam has to be fought for humane reasons, that you can't have any, for example, hatred, you can't have any desire for territorial expansion for its own sake, you can't have unjust motives, and you can't fight it unjustly. The concepts are very, very similar to what we've evolved, or what evolved in the West, and no less humane, just as impressive. And it's my great hope that Muslims rediscover those Islamic concepts of war. I wrote a small book on it to try and stimulate some discussion on this, called The Islamic Principles of War for the 21st Century, to try and get Muslims to reclaim proudly that very humane history. Inshallah ta'ala.
Inshallah. I know you're probably getting tired too, but there's one question that's bothering me, right? And we talked about a little bit about the Article 51, and we talked about civilians as well. And I know like there's some armies or some countries that require military service from males, right? There are quite many of them. Are all of them civilians or not? And then also, as we talked about that, as we talk about this current situation in Gaza, uh, potential genocide, or genocide, is that they're cutting off the water, they're cutting off the electricity, they're cutting off all the food and all the supplies. And what does the international law say about that? And that is again one of the very when you talk about intention of killing or not killing, that is that's intentional, right? One cannot, and blanket intention, just a blanket uh, deprivation of necessities of life, including water and other
I'll
things and
tell you
food.
why it's hard, because it's part of recent Western history. During the First World War, we tried to starve Germany into submission. The Royal Navy ringed Germany. Germany has a very small coastline. It's easy to cut off from the sea. It's not like Britain, which has a very large coastline. But in the First World War, both sides tried to sink every ship taking food and medicine and industrial products, everything, into each other's country. That was the way that war was prosecuted. And both sides did it. We did it. They did it.
It happened in India too,
The
like Indian famine. It happened quite a bit in Africa as well. So that was like one of the tools, if you will. It happened here in Canada and Africa, and sorry, Americas as well, and Australia and New Zealand in that part, right? I mean,
we also, during the Second World War, developed a thesis that morale was attached to the will to resist, and that if you broke an enemy's morale, their will to resist would collapse, the population would implode, and the government become non-functional. So we sent waves from 1940 to 1945 of bombers over German cities and destroyed 50 of them, 50 cities, and left them looking like Gaza. Well, did we do something wrong? Is that the word we would use for that? Well, those of us who did that, which means the British, the Americans, and their allies, wouldn't dream of saying that there was something wrong, let alone criminal in that. They just wouldn't. They would have said, it's harmful, call it evil if you like, but you'd have to call it a necessary evil. Because there was a greater good, which was defeating Nazi Germany. And that was what we judged to be the best way of breaking their will to resist. It's hard to argue in some ways against that claim, even though it involved the death of 1 million German civilians in their homes, bombed mostly at night from the air. But the reality, of course, and this is something that we have to address when we look at both Iran and Israel, is that actually dropping bombs on people tends to stiffen their resolve and not break their resolve. I wrote a book 25 years ago now on the Battle of Stalingrad, which was the worst battle in human history, the biggest and deadliest. More than 10,000 soldiers died every single day in one city in the Second World War. The Germans, on the 23rd of August, 1942, did the biggest German air raid of the Second World War on the city of Stalingrad, particularly to destroy what were called the factory areas where T-34s and other tanks were being produced. Well, what impact did that have? The answer is it turned big piles of rubble into small piles, or big piles of small rubble. And the Russian production of tanks hardly faltered. Red Army uniforms were made in Stalingrad. Production didn't decrease. The Germans didn't break the will of the Russians in Stalingrad with the most horrific attacks and bombing. You take the Blitz of British cities by the Germans in the Second World War. The British spirit was steeled, was stiffened by the Blitz. People are tough and hardy. And what tends to happen, even with unpopular governments, is that an attack upon citizens, civilians, makes the people throw their lot behind the government. It doesn't make them break. And you see that on both sides with this last week of war between Israel and Iran. It hasn't broken the will to fight on either side.
Mm.
And in fact, no one likes it. It's a terrible thing to see civilians suffering so horrifically. You notice that I'm right, that people are fighting on. They aren't broken. They aren't coward. They don't tremble in fear and say, oh, get us out of this war.
Right. Professor, I know we all you pretty tired too, and this is the last question. And after that, you can give me your last comments as well. So we were talking about Article 51 and the initiation on war, right? And there was a concept of preemptive war and defensive war, if you will. Um, and there was a concept you talked about potential harm, and that was the reason for the preemptive warfare. Now, international law, it does not define what is a just war and when can you fight a war, right? It only says you can do a self-defense. Certainly, preemptive self-defense is not self-defense. And what I mean by that is you do not apply law on potential. You apply law on the kinetics. What I mean by that is you don't imprison a man just because he has a potential to be a rapist. If that is the case, all the men will be rapists, right? And all of them will be in jail, right? So this and having this that um, the concept of this, you know, in the military warfare, that is a different, concept. But as far as the international law is concerned, it does not. I think there are like certain things that are called act of war, like if you attack an embassy or if you attack a military um, equipment or a military personnel, that becomes an act of war. Or if you cross the border, right? Um, and now, if, you know, uh, so those like recently in the Indian-Pakistan war, right? the recent conflict that they have, they did not actually cross the borders. They were just fighting behind their own borders, but they were inflicting damage to other countries. So, that is my point. Like, when you talk about like, Article 51, and you talk about, by you, I don't mean you personally, I just mean generally, like in the international law. When we talk about that, the concept of preemptive war is not defensive war. And that is what the argument I'm trying to say.
The thing that makes it can make it defensible is the concept of imminence. So let's say that you live next to a country, your country borders another country that clearly has an aggressive posture towards you. They don't like you, and they've made threats against you. Then you develop intelligence, gather intelligence that they're moving their forces towards your border in such a way that invasion is imminent. It's about to happen. You're foolish if you don't move first. So I'll give you an example. In the year,
But can that be used as a deceptive tactic, though, right? There could be a false premises for that.
well, it could be. So let's take the year 630. And our beloved Prophet, Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam,
So,
led an army of 10,000 and a bloodless takeover of Mecca. There were two very large tribes that were close to Mecca, around the area of Taif, called the Hawazin and the Thaqif tribes. They got together and thought, we either get Muhammad now or we're never going to have the chance. And they began to march towards Mecca. And the network of informants that beloved Prophet, peace be upon him, had told him that this was happening and this very large army was on its way. The Prophet didn't say, oh, well, how awful. We only fight defensively, so we have to wait until they attack us. He said we have to go out and do it to them before they do it to us. Get there first, do it first. So preemption can be reasonable if there's capability, capacity, if there's intention, and there's imminence. It's happening now.
the
That's
forces are in the
not
moment.
just.
The forces are in the movement. Basically, that's what it means. And in today's warfare, that could be, it could be 30 seconds or 1 minute, right? Never know.
But what seems a little more tendentious is the claim that one day they're going to have the capacity, or they might have it now. We know they hate us, they have an intention to harm us. There is no imminence. But one day there might be. One day they might decide to actually do it. So we have justification in attacking them. That seems pretty unreasonable. And
Thank you.
that again isn't easily prosecutable. The case would simply be made, well, they were going to do it at some point. They stated they were. Now, it's a bit bizarre if you draw on a mistranslation of a statement made by a former president 20 years ago as the justification for what you do now in terms of the intention. Some states simply don't like each other. It doesn't mean they actually want war with each other. Look, Pakistan and India pretty much hate each other's guts. They just don't like each other at all. They've got historical reasons for that, but it's a reality that they don't get on. But neither side intends war with the other, inshallah ta'ala. Neither side. Sometimes you learn to live with even people that you wish you didn't have to live with. You just get on with it. You just live with them. And most of the world, in some way or other, have people around them they disagree with over things. You look at the South China Sea. You look at Taiwan, you look at the countries around the Philippines, you look at the countries uh, around Southeast Asia. Lots of countries are living next to countries they don't like and would rather they didn't live next to. But it is what it is. And they don't use that as grounds for some type of military action
For a
against them.
preemptive war. Yep.
They simply don't.
Another, I think, notion just kind of outside of that is, how what India justified their war into Pakistan recently was kind of like, having potential camps or training camps and things like that. And that is again, I think, that was a concept I was talking about, that, it is not crossing the boundary. It's not a state versus state thing. It is an individual, non-state actors. And that again becomes something that is a nuance to it. And I know it's almost time and you're very, very tired. So please, if you have, anything to add to it, any last words, anything you want to leave this podcast with before, uh,
I think
it's
the only
almost
last
been like it's
thing,
2.5 hours. It's a very long one. Thank you so much for your time.
no, I'm enormously grateful. Look, this is a complex topic. War is complex, and the nature of war is hard to understand. It's terribly distressing when we see civilians dying, and they shouldn't die. It, to me, it's extraordinary that we spent the later years of the 19th century and all of the 20th century creating laws designed to protect civilians, and yet the ratio of civilians to combatants or non-combatants to combatants is 85% to 15%. In the wars in the world today, 85% of those who die or suffer wounding are civilians. And that doesn't even include those who flee for fear of their lives. You
Hmm.
go dropping bombs where there's civilians living, they aren't going to stay there in the hope that one won't fall on their house.
The refugees.
Move their children and they go. They cross borders as refugees. So these wars have harm beyond the immediate battlefield or even the civilian areas where things are fought in. And great human displacements occur. You look at what happened with Syria. You look at the movement, the mass migration of Syrians into southern Europe and even into northwestern Europe and elsewhere. Why? Not
Afghanistan too.
they want to get
Afghanistan
along,
too.
because they're
Yeah.
scared of death. And if you've got children, you're not going to say, well, the chances of a bomb killing my children, you say, we have to leave. We have to go. And the same thing happened in NATO itself in what was called a humanitarian intervention against Serbia, 1999, over the attempt to suppress the Kosovo Liberation Army. NATO said that's unjust. They're causing harm to civilians and civilians are fleeing. NATO then went and bombed all across where I think it was the 7th Serbian Army, I think, was in Kosovo. What did that cause? It caused more displacement of Kosovars.
Right.
That's what happens in war. Just, just the most shocking horrors. Think about the end of the Second World War. Even let's just take Germans alone. Germans in Eastern Europe, after the first week of May, when victory in Europe is declared, there are Germans that are living in Poland and Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, Czech Republic, everywhere now taking to the streets and fleeing. 10, 11, 12 million of them. Million. And that's just the Germans. Think about when the Germans went this way into Russia, 1941. Millions of Russians, tens of millions of Russians tried to flee out of the path of those advancing Germans. How many do you think died just in the attempt to get out of harm's way? It's just horrific. So, but again, amongst all of that, I think about, for example, the British Army in North Africa, where war was quite clean. There wasn't any racial agenda to fighting the Afrika Korps. The British would capture Germans, treat them with great humanity. The Germans would capture British Empire soldiers, including South Asians, by the way, in North Africa, and treat them with great humanity. So some things work, and sometimes emotions and other dynamic forces in society prevent it working, including racism. But one of the things that I take great comfort in is the power of the International Committee for the Red Cross and the Red Crescent. They, more than any other agency on earth, mitigate the harm done to civilians. And by international law, no state can exclude them. The United Nations, the International Committee of the Red Cross or Red Crescent, has the right to say, we want to see those prisoners of war. We want to go into that city, into that town, and see how people are treated. And by law, they can't be prevented. And thanks be to God, almost no one attempts to stop them. And they do such good work. You know, I can't stress how important the International Committee of the Red Cross and Red Crescent are. And again, that's something that is new and positive in the history of warfare.
Well,
Thank
thank you
you.
so much, Professor, for your time. And I think in this world of realpolitik where the international law is and the international systems are not, um, don't have the enforcement power, I guess, and seems like might is right. As someone said, if you want peace, prepare for war. So,
It will change. You know, international humanitarian law continues to evolve. And I think the wars we're seeing now with grotesque harm to civilians and the apparent unenforceability will create legal changes. Inshallah ta'ala.
inshallah, let's hope for it.
We have to hope for.
Thank you so much, Professor. Thank you so much for your time. I know it's a long day for you, and
Always nice to see you.
it's always a pleasure, and it's always a breath of fresh air talking to you and discussing these dynamics. Thank you so much, Professor.
You're
Assalamu
very
alaikum
welcome. Nice
warahmatullah.
to see you. Wa alaikum salam.
Likewise.